pitch, C. When you get to that point that you have that dominant pedal tone, that's associated with a retransition. So, all right, so that's another thing that you can look for, you know, when you're trying to place your labels on the form of a work. And you'll see that over and over again. So one of the things that happens then in the development section is that the composer is taking parts of the melody that you heard, melodies that you heard in the exposition, and sequencing those and working with them, discussing those themes. He moves away from the two main keys. And so in this one, it passed through D minor, and it touches on G minor for a moment at the top of the second page in the second measure. So you'll hear that when we listen to the recording. That's then sequenced down a step, and it touches on F major, and then it has the arrival at the dominant. So this is just a real compact version of sonata allegro form. What we're going to see in the Mozart Prague Symphony then is a work that's like 12 minutes, 13 minutes long. And so this is the basic structure, but everything is much, greater extended. But what happens in the development section is that it creates a sense of tension because it moves away from the main key of the movement, and it takes the themes apart and is discussing them so that when it returns to tonic and a restatement of the theme from the beginning, you have a sense of release. And so psychologically, it's something that has a sense of resolution and a sense of rest. So listen for that when we finally get to the recap at the third measure of that third line, second page. One other thing that you'll note in comparison to the way it was stated at the beginning is that at the beginning the dynamic level is forte. Now when it comes back in the recap, it's piano, so that also helps to have that feeling of being back home again, releasing the tension. But that's one of the kind of psychological elements of sonata allegro form, is that return to tonic and a restatement of the opening themes that is the final conclusion of the development section. So a lot of times that passage that leads up to the recap can be the most dramatic of the movement. So we'll just put here, so that's one place that we'll look at to see how the composer works with that spot within the form. All right, so you compare the recap to the exposition. What happens in the first measure of the fourth line on the second page? So look at the fourth line where it says forte, because that restates something. What's being restated right there from the exposition? So what corresponds to that? Show me the measure in the exposition that corresponds to that.
The measure on the first line.
So if you look at, okay, you said which measure of the fourth line?
Sorry, the fifth measure.
The fifth measure of which line?
On the first line.
Yeah, that's similar to the rhythm, but it's not exactly the same contour of the melody. There's a place where it's exactly the same contour. Yeah, second measure of the third line. And what was that in the exposition? Second measure of the third line. That was transition. So this spot, when it comes back, is then in a different key, but you want to label it the same way because you labeled that the second measure, third line on the first page is transition. So first measure, fourth line of that second page would be retransition. So the A theme was abbreviated. You only have one phrase of the A theme that's restated in the recap. Then immediately it goes to the retransition. So the composer will always work with the recap in a way that it's not just a literal restatement. He'll change things around, and that's typical. And so this leads to the cadence measure, which we saw on the first page on the fourth line, first measure, which had that progression 2-6, 1-6-4, 5-7-1. Where does that occur in the recap? So where's that pattern?
The fifth line, third measure.
Yeah, fifth line, third measure. So that last measure of that line then is where it cadences. And what are you expecting at that point as far as the key that it's going to cadence on? Because this is the end of the retransition. It's going to lead to a cadence on what key? Yeah, F major tonic. And so that's the basic element of the form, is that it's going to then have the retransition rewritten so that instead of modulating to a second key, it leads to a cadence in the home key. And then that then prepares that restatement of the B theme in F major, that last measure of that fifth line. And this is very similar, except instead of it going down an octave, it goes up an octave when it's restated where it says dolce. And so this is a real clear example of sonata allegro film. We're going to go back and listen now to the repeat of the exposition, and then we'll hear development and recap, and then I'll stop at that point. What was the loudest point in the movement? The retransition to the recap. Right. What is the dynamic marking there?
Fortissimo.
fortissimo, right? So that's typical, you know, composer would make that the most intense, the loudest. It's also one of the highest pitch levels, and you're expecting the harmony to change. One term that I want to introduce that you may have had before, but maybe not, is the term harmonic rhythm. And that has to do with the rate of change of the harmony. So in general, a Baroque style features a faster harmonic rhythm. So you expect there to be more chords per measure as compared to a classical style, which will have fewer chords per measure. Okay, so if you have one of those copies that has in-class copy written on it, pass that across as I want to collect that. So those of you that I pass this out to. All right, so background for the classical period, Viennese classicism, has to do with the era of thought in Western Europe that is known as the Enlightenment. So this is the background for Viennese classicism. So sometimes this era is known as the Age of Reason. And so you first start to see this mid-17th century, but it particularly has to do with 18th century philosophy. So we'll put here circa something around 1650 to 1800 or so. And it's something that features a conflict of faith and reason. And so this means that the teachings of the church were in conflict with scientific discovery. So Copernicus, who made the discovery that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but that the Earth revolved around the sun, was something that was in conflict with what the church taught. And so this idea of logic and deciding what was true being based on scientific experiments and empirical data is what drove then this sense of criticism of the establishment. So it very much had to do with this idea of revolt, rebellion against authority. And it has then lots of ramifications that occurred. Some of the most important were the revolutions in America and in France. And so it's tied up with the whole idea of democracy. That look back to the ideals of the ancient Greeks from 4th and 5th century BC. And so we'll put here Voltaire, he was French, Rousseau, these two French philosophers are important with this idea of of natural kind of thought and basing decision on logic. And so the Greeks were very much into analyzing and codifying, cataloging, trying to make order out of the universe. And so this idea of logic and balance and symmetry, I'll put here order, then were important. You can see, like in the architectural style of this age, that it was based on this Greek model of bilateral symmetry. So if you think of the Parthenon, or you think of the architecture in Washington, D.C., which was a neoclassical style from that era of the 18th century, that is based on this idea of balance and proportion. And so those ideas are very important. So this basic element of conflict was something that was happening during the Enlightenment, and especially in the 18th century in Europe. And so you had the end of the old regime, the aristocracies, the absolute oligarchies that then were coming to an end, and they exploded then with these revolutions in this the emergence of democracy. So this era is very much a humanitarian era. It's very much human-centered. So you have groups like the Freemasons that arise, which have to do with universal brotherhood and equality. You see during this era the rise of the middle class, of the merchant class, and they had greater economic might. One of the things that affects music with the rise of the middle class is the fact that the middle class wanted to have access to music, which had been the possession of the aristocracy. And so you start to have instructional manuals that are written for the average person about how to play keyboard instruments, or how to play the violin, or how to play the flute. And so important treatises were written. I'm going to mention three of these that were written in the 1750s.